you.
Karin, I'm from the University of Birmingham. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about my research, some of the kind of theological, theoretical components behind it to some extent, our observations in the world of biomedical semantics, moving into some of the projects that I've been working on. So sorry that I couldn't be with you today. Unfortunately, I got COVID. And therefore international travel became unwise, but hopefully this format works just fine. I'll try to talk about it clearly in this case, and hopefully it is okay. So every now and again I like to return to the question of why it is we're doing what we're doing. And the way that I like to conceptualize it is this. Data are what make evaluation systematic, and therefore are what make science. So I use the data in a systematic way. However, data by themselves do not actually mean anything. They're completely ambiguous. And so I like to, on different kind of levels, conceptualize these problems in science as problems ultimately of ambiguity resolution. And this works whether we're trying to identify what it is a token means, or whether we're trying to predict an unknown diagnosis for a patient or something like this. And this kind of conceptual device is very useful. Humans are good at solving ambiguity, computers not so much. We can train them in individual tasks to do this kind of thing. But the kind of project, to some extent, of biomedical semantics is in the field of semantics, in the field of biomedicine, is to try to build explicit semantics for the meanings of the kinds of things that we're working in those worlds, to allow us to, in a computational way, work with those data, to resolve ambiguity in such a way that at a higher kind of strata of meaning, we can also resolve ambiguity based on this background knowledge. And so the way that we kind of realize this is through our kind of linked data paradigm to some extent, where we link particular data to each other and also to some kind of domain conceptualization. Usually an ontology, especially I suppose for the people here in medicine and healthcare, of course, we're also working a lot with kind of domain vocabularies, of course. And so when we create linked data, we provide and make use of background knowledge in two main ways, really. One is this kind of axiomatic knowledge based in the domain conceptualization, the things that are always true about particular things in the world, and this is how we collect our kinds of things or concepts or classes. But we also provide background knowledge by virtue of the fact that, for example, when we create a linked data representation of a patient, we're also linking it to all of the other examples of patients that are annotated in that way, right? So implicitly, if we look at this example here, we're linking this patient to all the other patients with global developmental delay, and we're able to make use of that information as well, because it's linked. And ultimately, this is kind of the point, but also more specifically, and what I think is kind of exciting is that it's a very kind of reciprocal kind of relationship, right? When we create linked data, when we use linked data to learn from data, we're both benefiting from this collective web of knowledge, but we're also contributing to it. And this is how I like to think about it to some extent, whether we call it FAIR or biomedical semantics or whatever we want to in this context. So let's think about one of the kind of distinctions that falls at the center of this kind of paradigm. We have this kind of set of concepts that we work with to some extent, that all collect around this kind of general idea of a conceptualization and an instance. So if we're thinking in the kind of description logic world, we might talk about our T-box and our P-box. We're thinking of kind of object-oriented programming. We might talk about our classes and our objects, concepts and things. If we're thinking in literature, we may talk about archetypes and examples. In linguistics, types and tokens. These are all kind of names and concepts for the same kind of thing. right? The same kind of distinction drawn between general features of something and a particular instance, or a particular realization of that thing in the world. And it's a kind of interesting distinction because it is a specific kind of more specific thing, but it's specific in that it's more specified. But there's a kind of interesting source of background information, of foundational knowledge in biomedicine that doesn't really neatly fit into this kind of set of distinctions here. If we think back to our kind of linked data paradigm, it doesn't necessarily fit into the provision of background knowledge by virtue of linking to other examples of the thing, nor does it fit strictly into axiomatic knowledge, but it's kind of its own secret thing to some extent. So we have what are called relational knowledge bases, and these define some kind of relationship between kinds of biomedical entities. Obviously, we find them outside of biomedicine as well, but these are the kind of examples that we're working with today. And they do provide kind of background knowledge, they do provide context for the entities that we provide, even though they don't describe particular instances of those things. So we might have databases that describe diseases and phenotypes, genes and proteins or functions, diseases and other diseases which perhaps co-occur with them, chemicals and biological effects at different kind of points down the line there. So there are two primary components of these relational knowledge bases. One is the kind of domain classification or ontology, one or more of these, which we all know are some kind of resource describing a conceptualization of the domain, the kinds of things that we're interested in studying in those domains, and then also a set of relations that map between entities within one or more of those domain classifications. So there are some interesting qualities of relational knowledge bases as we find them out in the real world. One is that they tend to lack a kind of standard representation. They've been kind of formed to some extent as auxiliary kind of knowledge bases that sit aside our ontologies quite often. The files will tend to be relatively well specified in the case of large ontologies, such as the human phenotype ontology or the gene ontology. Sometimes in more modern times we find them nicely defined as kind of link-ML. In worst cases we find them defined in some kind of cursed Excel file, or even worse in some cases. There is actually the kind of BioLink model which provides a really nice representation, kind of formalism for describing these relationships between biomedical entities. To some extent it's not used very heavily yet, so we're kind of seeing movements towards that direction. I would also note that to some extent it doesn't fill all of the actual use cases of these relational databases. It kind of assumes that we're taking a kind of, for example, a real sample of patients, and that there's some kind of occurrence in that database, which is not necessarily the model that we're working with in a lot of cases, even in healthcare. The other feature that we often find is that there tends to be very limited kind of encoding and representation of evidence and provenance of the kind of relationships that we find. We have good cases here, so here is the kind of decision tree around creating annotations for evidence codes in the gene ontology, which is a really nice kind of system that we have, and we have some kind of indication alongside particular links to publications and things like this that allow us to identify the kind of provenance and the reason that something was annotated and the reason that this kind of relation exists. Often in other kind of environments this is not the case. Often it will be part of the kind of conceptual modeling work that was done, but without the kind of formalism of ontologies to provide us a model that kind of forces us to provide kind of authorship information or some kind of link to information that was used to make this judgment. I will say again that BioLink does provide the kind of formalism that allows us to define this, and this is good. Another kind of interesting quality, again, not so much in the gene ontology annotations, but especially across lots of different other databases, especially in the kind of healthcare world, the actual relationship that encodes the associations between the different entities is not actually strongly defined. In the best case here, we actually have something that's linked to static identifier from an actual relational ontology, be that the relational ontology or your own kind of classification from your ontology. Most of the time, it's kind of actually left as a kind of exercise for the later user of the relational knowledge base to identify what that actual relationship is, which is not so good. And so the other thing that's kind of interesting, and is less of a kind of dig, I suppose, is that a lot of the relationships are not axiomatic, right? So they're often probabilistic. They're things that may co-occur with something. They're symptoms that may appear in the case of a particular disease, and they may have some kind of relationship, but it's not fully qualified, it's not fully known. Or it may depend on a particular, for example, subtype of a disease that's not actually specified in this relational database. There may be quantification kind of information that's in there or implied. And so for these reasons, relational knowledge bases are kind of an interesting case. They do form our kind of foundational knowledge surrounding biomedicine, but they don't describe things that are always true about the instances. They don't describe necessary and sufficient conditions for something being something. There's some relationship there, probably, but it's not specified. And so for this reason, it doesn't fit neatly into our kind of axiomatic formal representation of the kinds of things in our domain. In the same way, or conversely, it doesn't describe specific features of instances, it describes general features of groups of instances. And it is intended as background knowledge. It's intended as foundational knowledge that we can use to learn from things in the world. And so for this reason, I call it a kind of secret thing. And I think that this is why it's worth paying a little bit of attention. So we can talk quickly through some examples and what they're useful for in this world. So the first is, of course, gene annotations that links genes with functions. And this is, I suppose, as with a lot in the ontology world, one of the great success stories, I suppose, of background knowledge and its use in biomedicine. The reason for this, of course, is that it's widely used in gene set enrichment. And this is essentially using these annotations that we have to find terms or groups of terms that are overrepresented, that are surprising to have been found in a particular group of genes that we derive from our experiments, be it biological or computational. And this is a pretty standard feature of scientific study that involves these kinds of things, but it relies on this large relational knowledge base of genes to functions. It's an example, to some extent, of a really well-specified relational database. As we discussed, we cover all of these kinds of examples of evidence codes, ability to link to publications, and other useful kind of features there. But most importantly, it's had a lot of kind of labor, a lot of work put into the kind of manual curation, the development of electronic inference approaches that makes it a really high quality database with good coverage ultimately of the domain. The other side of this world, and I talk about this example because it's the one that I work in most kind of frequently, and these are relational knowledge bases that describe diseases and phenotypes. So the canonical example here, or the kind of most popular example, I suppose, that you would see in publications are the kind of human phenotype annotations that link rare diseases in ONE and ORPHANET to human phenotype ontology codes. These come from the kind of original clinical descriptions of patients that were held in the OMIP database and are used for all kinds of different studies, especially surrounding kind of variant prioritization and this kind of thing. More recent examples surrounds the kind of collection of phenotypes to diseases, common diseases that are often given text-minded scale from literature, which we'll talk a little bit more about very soon. One of the things that's kind of interesting is that some of these kind of relations do make their way into the conceptualization space. For example, the disease ontology does include some object relations, axiomatic definitions surrounding the symptoms of diseases using their own symptom classification. For example, here we see that actinomycosis has a symptom of granulomatous inflammation, and also abscess and asthenia, much easier to say, along with the other kind of axioms that we use to describe this class. So it's kind of interesting to consider this. This kind of has symptom is a subclass of the relation ontology. Relation has phenotype, which is kind of interesting in the sense that it's not actually very specific about the nature of the relationship between the two entities, right? In fact, I think you could distill to some extent this relation to something that was ultimately completely generic, other than the kind of range and domain of the kind of thing. And this is something that's very interesting in the kind of disease phenotype knowledge-based space, where we have links between diseases and phenotypes, but it's not really clear what they are. And it's kind of interesting too that there's also a kind of implied probabilistic nature to these things. This is a kind of piece of text from the documentation for OMIP, where we describe that there are these kind of classifications of how often a phenotype appears with a particular disease. And this is a kind of example of the way that it's not really kind of axiomatic knowledge in the way that we normally encode it in biomedical ontologies. It also falls into kind of several different categories here as well. So one of the things that these disease phenotype associations are useful for is as kind of foundational knowledge for, well, anything concerning diseases. So one of our studies a couple of years ago, for example, looked at kind of ranking diagnoses for common diseases based on some of the phenotypes that were mined from literature. And this worked relatively well to some extent using the 2015 Kondor kind of collection of phenotype associations. This is kind of a standard use to some extent. It's classical in the sense that we've collected some kind of patient phenotype profiles and we compare them with some kind of foundational background knowledge phenotype profiles. We can also, of course, use it for kind of enrichment purposes, which we'll talk a little bit about in the future as well. But now I want to talk a little bit about what is a kind of special piece to some extent of these relational knowledge bases, which has kind of been interesting to me for a little while. There's a particular kind of relational knowledge base that you could also conceptualize as a more general kind of relational knowledge base, where what they're capturing is not so much this idea of a gene encoding particular functions. It's an entity and its relationship with another entity where the actual relation is co-occurrence in a corpus. It's that those entities appear together in some context. And often in this case, the relation isn't actually specified, but what's intended by this is that there's some kind of meaningful relationship between the occurrence of these entities, the co-occurrence of these entities in there, and some meaningful information to a particular end. For example, the chemical entities mentioned in some kind of adverse outcome pathway text have something to do with that adverse outcome pathway, or the diseases and phenotypes that tend to co-occur in text have something to do with each other. So we may kind of assume a relationship in this case, and this depends a little bit on the kind of corpus that we're using to some extent. So, you know, if we're looking at text that provides kind of clinical descriptions of particular patients, then we might assume that this is some kind of house-phenotype association, especially if we perform some kind of context disambiguation to identify that it's referring to the subject of the text. I should note that it's not always a text mining analysis. It may be a kind of analysis of a particular corpus of patients based on the database, for example, in EHR, of occurrence of phenotypes in these cases. One of the things that's kind of interesting about this is that we're kind of using co-occurrence as a shortcut to association, especially in these kinds of low resource environments, unlike the Bio-Ontology, where we don't have this massive work for kind of curation of these resources. So, as one example, a piece of work we did last year surrounding the kind of AOP wiki for adverse outcome pathways. It's kind of a moving towards a kind of verified approach to representing these adverse outcome pathways, which links exposures to particular chemicals to negative outcomes in biological settings, and kind of encoding these as a tool for new approach methodologies in drug safety evaluations. So the work we did was essentially looking at the text that's associated with these different key events, these different kind of objects that sit along these adverse outcome pathways, and identifying things like gene symbols, disease names, phenotype names, and associating those in the knowledge base. And this is an associative knowledge base because it essentially uses the assumption that because it appears in the text associated with those events, it has something to do with it. And this is an example of a kind of strong association to some extent. You know, I think we have quite a good indication that if we're mentioning phenotype in this case, that it derives from this event, and it's strongly correlated with this kind of thing. So another example is of disease phenotypes, and these are often essentially based on co-occurrence of diseases and phenotypes, their overexpression in text, often in literature. There are two kind of major works of this in the last couple of years, one from Packus, one from Pilavar, and these kind of perform text mining analyses of diseases and phenotypes as mentioned in literature abstracts, collecting those that are essentially overexpressed as phenotypes of those diseases. So some of the interesting things about associative knowledge bases are that what you end up with are deeply dependent on the information extraction methods you use. This is true in the case of databases, but it's even more true in the case of text mining. So one of the kind of dirty secrets to some extent of text mining is that it doesn't work very well. So here's an example of a good paper from Tudor Grosso recently, which is good because it develops a kind of new approach for NER and linkage to the human phenotype ontology in using kind of state-of-the-art kind of approaches, and it works relatively well. They also perform a comparison to some of the popular existing approaches for recognition of human phenotype ontology terms from literature articles, and you can see from that table 2 here that despite their relatively good performance, the best performers are still only really performing at a relatively low threshold. If we consider that we're only picking up 0.57 or 0.29 or 0.41 of the terms that are actually there, we're missing a massive amount here. And the interesting thing to note is also that we're biased against things that don't have many annotations with which we can use to train our models, things with complicated labels, things that are kind of deep in there and come into the kind of region of, fifth factorial of the kind of hand, and this kind of thing, that there's going to be a lot of kind of variance in how people are expressing this in the text. So it's a kind of interesting case here. And we showed from our kind of previous work, for example, that improving the kind of named entity recognition of labels in these cases improves the kind of characterization of the entities that you end up with and affects kind of downstream tasks as well. So this is one of the kind of interesting things about using text mining specifically for the production of associative knowledge bases. The second is that this kind of collocation or association study, it's kind of academic lineology. Its history comes from linguistic corpus analysis, which obviously has, to some extent, quite different aims to our investigations into the correlation of biomedical concepts in text, though obviously it's strongly related. We're using it in a different context, but there are also different ways to measure collocation or correspondence in a database or in a corpus. And these, of course, affect the representation that we end up with of that domain. So, for example, we can use raw frequency, which has its own kind of drawbacks. Pointwise mutual information is a very common method. Both of the CAPCUS work kind of uses this to identify co-occurrence between biomedical entities using this method, but it's very easy to get very high scores in the case that things appear very infrequently in the database, and this can end up with some kind of very magnified or erroneous kind of associations very easily in these cases. We have other methods that we can use as well, and all of these kind of methods have their own kind of, they have their own peculiarities, and it's not obvious that PMI, for example, should be the best use case in all of these kind of use cases, and we'll look into this in more data-driven way very soon. The other kind of thing that follows on from this use of association method is that we're often seeking kind of binary associations. We're often seeking kind of foundational profiles where we can say, this set of phenotypes is associated with this set of diseases or this disease. So the question naturally arises is, at what point do we say associated is associated? At what point can we draw this kind of cutoff? Some of the methods that we use to provide to measure collocation essentially provide as a p-value that we can use, and we can perhaps use kind of standard values here. The other kind of implied problem here is that we have this issue of kind of multiple testing, especially in case that we're using a kind of very large corpus. The other approach that tends to be used is fitting the set of associations and deciding the kind of cutoff for associations using either recapitulation of existing databases or fitting it to a particular task. So seeing at what point in cutoff you continue to get value when you perform a kind of task such as kind of protein-protein interaction prediction or something like this, which has its own kind of problems, especially if we're using these as kind of exploratory resources. We, to some extent, are fitting it to a particular task and then selling it as something foundational that we can use for kind of general use, which may be true, but it perhaps is fit to this particular kind of issue. So another kind of interesting variable we find in these cases is that, of course, they are ultimately representations of the corpus that we're using. And again, we'll discuss this in a more kind of data-driven way very soon. But if we think, for example, about an associative knowledge base that was drawn from Limit 3, which is a kind of semi-public EHR system that provides kind of text for 60,000 or so emergency care stays in a hospital in the US. This would be a very useful kind of quick resource, one that you can make available due to the semi kind of public nature of Mimic, but of course it's going to be a representation of this particular cohort of patients. So, for example, it's an emergency care setting. These patients are very sick. They tend to have very particular diseases and diseases that exist at very particular kind of stages in their progression. So, for example, there are many people who have liver disease due to kind of excess alcohol consumption, for example, but it's not a good representation of liver disease as a general concept, as a general disease, because it appears only in its very kind of end stages where people are being hospitalized for it to some extent. And I think it's very easy to obscure the fact that these associative knowledge bases are ultimately just proxy representations of the data that they're being used that have been used to derive them. So I think the observation here is that ultimately associative knowledge bases, though we think of them, I think, in a foundational way, they're ultimately a representation of the data, methods, and assumptions that we use to produce them. And I think this is another reason that ultimately they don't fit very neatly into this kind of conceptualization space as well. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research that I've done to kind of explore some of these kind of questions and variables and areas of interest, as well as some of the things that are kind of ongoing. So we talked about this kind of question of substrates, the data that was used to produce associative knowledge bases. We talked about some of the cases in healthcare where this might be kind of biased to a particular kind of sample of patients. Well, we think applying this kind of model to this question of producing associative knowledge bases from literature, we find that these resources are then entirely representations of this kind of scientific understanding of disease. And the question is, does this align strongly with, for example, patients' understanding of diseases and patients' priorities of disease, or the public's priority on diseases, or even the clinician's understanding of disease? And it seems that not much work has been done in exploring this, despite very large corpus of work showing that stakeholders in healthcare have deeply different kind of understandings, priorities, and conceptualizations of disease. Some of our previous work on uveitis found that patients kind of understood their diseases deeply, were more worried about kind of side effects of kind of drugs, use different words to refer to things. There's lots of kind of canonical evidence out there as well of patients having different priorities surrounding things like the meaning of, for example, a stable cancer, which might be good news to a clinician, but bad news to a patient. And it's kind of interesting as well, when we're building these kind of foundational knowledge resources from literature, we introduce this kind of feedback loop where we're then finding things from these kind of resources and introducing them back to the literature, essentially reinforcing that kind of knowledge. And so I'm kind of interested to some extent is to try to integrate some novel perspectives, to explore how well different substrates and different representations of disease align with each other and see what can be found from this kind of environment. So our initial kind of hypothesis here was that an associative resource derived from public and patient data will be significantly, largely different from these existing resources derived from scientific sources, primarily literature or biomedical databases. So we formed a collaboration with the kind of White Swan charity in the UK, who work with kind of social media data to study diseases, and we developed this kind of associative phenotype model for disease phenotype associations. For 311 diseases, we were limited in the number of diseases that we could work with due to the financial constraints of working with social media data and treating it. We performed this kind of associative study in a similar way to those that have been performed in literature. And we also produce with this large combined resource of biomedical and literature phenotypes. And this comes from the Collier and Tapkis works that we discussed previously. And the idea here was to create the largest possible resource of all phenotype and disease associations from literature and biomedical understanding that we could, in a very kind of general way, to try to see whether we could identify things that were represented in social media that weren't represented in this biomedical and literature kind of understanding of diseases. So we can talk a little bit about some of the methodological considerations of this kind of study. So the kind of problems that we had were that we wanted to essentially match to some extent our methodology to the biomedical and literature derivations we could, but we had some problems here. One is that PMI is kind of interesting, as we previously discussed, because it has this problem of kind of inflating values for phenotypes that appear kind of very rarely. We also have this problem that we're trying to find new phenotypes. So it doesn't really help us to try to fit this to a particular kind of task. And this provides us with the problem of trying to identify cutoffs. This question of how associated is associated when we're trying to identify sets of phenotypes for diseases. And the kind of solution here is to simulate the data set ultimately. And this allows us to overcome this problem when using PMI of inflated values for things that appear rarely. And we also kind of stole the idea from GWAS studies where we can use Q values to identify a kind of acceptable false discovery rates for P values using the results of this kind of simulation. And this provided us a very nice kind of database of phenotype associations that were relatively highly statistically significant. And this is something that we completed. So we identified 35,782 disease phenotype associations for these 311 diseases, fewer than those contained in the biomedical literature resource. But the kind of interesting finding here is that a majority of those associations were actually novel in the sense that they weren't contained in the biomedical literature resource at all. And this included, of course, acknowledgement of the kind of structure of the ontology. So novel phenotype is anything that doesn't have an equivalent or more specific subclass in the biomedical literature phenotype model. Conversely, quite a lot of the phenotypes in the BBRP were not contained in the other database either. And so we can look at a kind of thematic analysis by organizing phenotype associations into facets of the human phenotype ontology. These are the high-level kind of organizational categories that cover the relative height of the ontology. We find a really big peak in constitutional symptoms, symptoms described as affecting quality of life. And this is a kind of interesting facet of the human phenotype ontology, because I think ultimately probably a lot of the phenotypes that are in the entire human phenotype ontology probably may fall into this conditionally. But what we found when we looked into these is that ultimately a lot of this is made up by pain. In fact, the majority of these kind of constitutional phenotypes are made up of pain, and our kind of judgment from this is that the priorities of patients when they're discussing diseases and the public when they're discussing diseases are questions of pain. We also looked at focuses on disease areas as well by using the kind of associative kind of areas of the disease ontology, and we found that there's a greater focus on endocrine, digestive, and reproductive diseases in this case, and this allowed us to identify kind of different kind of priorities in diseases in these kind of areas as well. So as we mentioned, the kind of groups of diseases, groups of phenotypes surrounding pain were far more well represented. One of the things that was kind of interesting though is that they were much more generic to some extent in the social media derived phenotypes found in the biomedical and database literature phenotypes on the left, which you can see is far more widely spread surrounding the different kind of pain ontology module kind of there, whereas we have a relatively sparse projection of relatively high-level phenotypes on the right here, which is kind of interesting, but of course the overall amount of phenotype associations was much greater than those that was contained in the other thing. And I think this may indicate that for many diseases, pain is something that is ultimately not discussed in literature very much concerning those diseases, despite being priorities for patients. So one of the things we were kind of interested in, both for validating our own results, but also for looking at the kind of validity of the existing phenotypes in the biomedical and literature resources, was to look at how this aligns with clinical views, clinical understandings of these diseases. And so we asked a set of 10 consultant clinicians with a relatively kind of high knowledge of the field, being consultants for diseases that they were specialists in and had an active practice in, to kind of review the phenotype associations randomized in order and blinded to which of the sources they came from. We asked them whether these phenotypes were established in literature, treatment guidelines, or policy. We also asked them what kind of association it is, and also how often they actually see those phenotypes in the course of their practice. So to do this, we came up with a kind of classification of the different kinds of phenotype association in collaboration with these clinicians, which I hope can be kind of adapted into perhaps the relational ontology or our kind of associative databases for the description of phenotypes. Because of course we have to note that our sets of associations here just mean that, you know, they co-occur in text. You know, it doesn't mean that this is a symptom or a sign. We're just performing this kind of analysis on the basis of this kind of observation that if these things co-occur in text, they probably have something to do with each other. So the results of this, in our kind of first validity question, that the level of kind of association here, the distribution of answers was quite similar for the biomedical database and literature to the social media phenotype model. So this is good for the validity of our kind of results, but the observation here is that more than 30% of phenotype associations were judged as definitely wrong or unlikely by clinicians in both cases. And I think this is quite interesting. Some of these may be perhaps that the clinicians weren't aware of those phenotypes, but I think that it's probably well kind of beyond this point, and ultimately it's a pretty large error rate for something that is kind of being touted as kind of phenotypes of these diseases. So we also looked at the type of associations to find that there's a pretty strong kind of spread of these associations across these kinds of areas. More of the kind of phenotypes were seen as comorbidities or having an unknown relationship in the social media phenotype model, but ultimately the distributions were relatively similar and not to be kind of correlated. Another interesting finding was that the social media phenotype results were seen more often in clinic, and you can see this very nicely on the kind of visual here. But again, in both cases, more than 50% were seen never or rarely. And this is true, of course, for both the social media phenotypes as well as the biomedical literature and database phenotypes as well. So we also used the results of this clinical study to kind of highlight and look into some particular kind of phenotypes that were ultimately perhaps good identifications for hypotheses for perhaps kind of novel phenotypes, things that weren't discussed in the biomedical databases or literature, but clinicians rated them as at least being feasible and were seen in clinic sometimes. There are some kind of very interesting cases here. Some of them are kind of potentially really nice examples of what may turn out to be kind of new phenotypes that patients are aware of, but literature doesn't discuss. Some of them are very obviously kind of derived from error in the literature derived studies, such as diminished ability to concentrate, not being considered in the BDLP as a phenotype of fibromyalgia, given the fact that this is ultimately a very central phenotype of this disease. And this also shows an example of how kind of concordance or difference between these databases can try to bring us kind of better representations of these diseases, but also highlights how the biomedical database and literature phenotypes ultimately aren't capturing the full representations of these diseases. So we can confirm a hypothesis. You know, the social media view is obviously very different in composition, in theme. But the other interesting finding here is that neither view aligns especially well with the clinical experience and the clinical understanding of these diseases, both in terms of what they consider to be valid associations, but also in terms of how often they see those phenotypes in clinic, even if they are valid. So the question arises, how strongly does this actually align with something that's relevant to clinical uses, and raises questions around how we're then using those in the context of downstream tasks in this kind of clinical healthcare analytic kind of world. So as a note of what we're working on subsequent to this study, we're looking at now a resource that actually encodes patients' information based on the really nice Bio-Ontologies work. We were able to map patient condition occurrence information from the UK Biobank, which describes 500,000 or so people, and allows us to kind of escape this problem of what is probably largely variance in text mining kind of approach to look at actual prevalence in a sample population. Of course, we still have these issues of kind of mapping, which all comes under a kind of variable of information extraction and the difference in bias here. But we're also able in the same way to derive a kind of associative database based on occurrence of these diseases and phenotypes here too. So how well does this align with the social media phenotype model and the biomedical literature model? You can see from the radar chart on the side that it matches much more strongly with the social media model than it does with the literature model, which is an interesting kind of initial indication that perhaps the clinical view aligns more strongly with the social media view than does the literature understanding of diseases. And we're kind of working on developing this kind of understanding of the UK Biobank's perspective on disease more. And so another thing that I want to mention to kind of illustrate some of the kind of variability of the different approaches that we can use in this case, is to look at how these different methods have measuring co-location in databases affects the kind of makeup of our associative databases. So here's for calculating association between diseases and phenotypes in UK Biobank, using all of these kind of different methods, and then calculating the kind of check-card index of the concordance between those methods. You can see, and I know you like looking at tables of numbers, that these are massively different. The composition of the disease phenotypes for the top 1% and the top 10% of scores is massively different between these methods. And this goes into also how it recapitulates ground truth. We looked at, for both the social media raw data and UK Biobank raw data, how well these kind of scores ranked phenotypes that were included in the kind of ground truth. And we can see that PMI works pretty well, actually, in both cases, but there's a large range of kind of performances based on the choice of these methods in this case. So we can also see how this affects our kind of downstream tasks. We take the kind of classical semantic similarity differential diagnosis task based on kind of omen diseases, based on instance data, patient phenotype profiles that we're trying to predict their disease based on background information from phenotype profiles derived from the social media phenotype model using these different methods. We find that there's a really large kind of variance of performances based on these items. And here we only look at a kind of static method of choosing kind of cutoffs here, either 1% or 5% or 10% of the kind of top the top scores there. And obviously there are lots of different ways to do this as well. And our next kind of step is to look at these kind of different methods of cutoff. And of course, the finding these kind of decision boundaries to some extent in a kind of heuristic or pre-assumed kind of way is a little bit uploaded to some extent, and kind of modern machine learning methods are going to do this better. But that kind of illustrates some of the variables and how they affect downstream, how we can do our tasks. But the thing is, that's interesting here is that we're making all of these assumptions, providing these kind of knowledge bases that we're then using very widely, but perhaps not taking into account that the methods that we use are going to be more or less useful for different tasks and different underlying data sets as well. So I just want to talk a little bit now about the kind of different method of identifying association. So we talked a little bit about enrichment analysis earlier in the context of gene ontology annotations. One thing that I find kind of interesting here is that it's relatively inoften applied outside of this kind of context of gene set enrichment, but it would be very useful in the case also of kind of disease phenotypes and phenotypes that are expressed in a particular, represented in a particular disease or set of diseases or disease module. And you can see how this is ultimately a kind, to some extent, of relation kind of extraction. We're trying to find things that are kind of overexpressed in relation to one thing or group of things. There are, of course, some limitations to enrichment analysis. It tends to be univariate, testing individual relationships between terms and entities. And they tend to use a relatively kind of limited method of kind of measuring overexpression, usually a kind of Z-score. And this provides a limited kind of characterization between the terms and the group of interest that we're exploring. So in our recent paper, we looked at a kind of multivariable method of kind of identifying exploratory modules or groups of terms to describe groups of annotated entities. And we measure inclusivity, how explanatory a particular term is of all of the members of the group. Exclusivity, how explanatory is it with members of other groups, something that we're trying to minimize, as well as integrating information content as well, to identify multivariable groups of terms. We can treat this as a kind of multi-objective optimization problem, which you can receive more information on in the context of the paper. And we applied this in this kind of medical context of trying to identify the differences between the diseases pulmonary embolism and pneumonia, using the kind of test case of limit. This is a useful thing in an emergency care setting because these are diseases that have very similar phenotype profiles. And if one is distinct as the other, it can be not very good. So we produce phenotype profiles for these patients and used our methods. We can use this tool, Karuji, that we developed to implement these features to identify that indeed the phenotypes of these diseases in these patients is very similar, recapitulating what is known by the literature in this case, and also that the prevalences are very interesting. The prevalences are very similar. So when we think about enrichment, we're thinking about things that are surprising to find, things that are overrepresented in a particular group of annotations, but we're thinking of this in the kind of global environment, in the context of all of the annotations that exist. But we can choose a different background distribution. So what if, for example, in this case of pneumonia and pulmonary embolism, instead of thinking about this kind of background distribution of the entire set of patients, we think about what's surprising to find for pulmonary embolism in the context of pneumonia and pulmonary embolism patients. And this allows us to kind of escape this problem of finding things that are compositional, but don't help us tell the difference between these diseases. By using this kind of model, this kind of assumption, we can identify discriminatory groups, especially using this kind of exclusion measure of how little or how exclusionary a particular phenotype or set of phenotypes is for a kind of group. And we applied this in the case of pneumonia and pulmonary embolism to identify also in my clinical practice about distinguishing these patients, as well as finding some items that weren't necessarily considered by literature. But the nice thing about this is that also you come up with this kind of module, but you can also use the exclusion score for classifying those patients in a relatively kind of simple way. It works pretty well. It works better than semantic similarity in this case. But the interesting thing about this, I think, is also that you can use this on any type of entity, right? We shouldn't be just limiting our kind of uses to kind of gene set enrichment. We have kind of any linked data, packets, for example. We can use this kind of method on them to identify explanatory kind of modules for in a global context, but also in a discriminatory context, in the kind of head-to-head way, or in a small kind of group of diseases that is tuned to a particular kind of task that we're trying to solve. So, with this in mind, I should wrap up and say that we should really try to be aware of the fact that these associative databases are kind of foundational knowledge resources that are really a product of the different variables that are involved in their development, and we should explore kind of different methods and different substrates and see how they can bring us to a greater and more holistic understanding of the things that we're studying in biomedicine. I also have some kind of projects that I wanted to talk about a little bit here as well, but there's not much time. But feel free to message me or talk to me about them subsequently. But thanks so much for inviting me and allowing me to talk. Here are some of my funders and collaborators and projects, as well as my cat. Thank you. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Karin, for the presentation. We are trying to get you on the screen. It will take just a minute. In the meantime, we have some time for questions. So please, if you have a question or a comment, please move towards this. We will start the questioning in a second, just once we can. We just need to move this one over there. This whole thing. Because Karin is right there, so we just need to move this whole thing over there. Yeah. Ah. Okay. Yeah, sorry, it's the first time we are doing this remotely, so
She should mute herself.
Aha.
Got unmute.
Yes.
She should unmute.
Karin?
Am I audible now?
Yeah, we can kind of hear you-ish. Okay. So otherwise, we have to translate. So we have some opportunity for a question. So maybe, but please, if you could.
Hi, I'm just trying to link this also like the first talk here yesterday. So I mean, it seems that like basically, I mean, it's interesting because like it also coincides with this sort of like soul searching for like, should this COSI continue on? So I mean, just to be clear, it's my first time here, and I'm absolutely exhilarated to be here, and I'm kind of saddened by the thought that it might not be there moving forward. But I think that this sort of reflects a lot of themes that have emerged over the past decade or decades. Like, so I mean, from what I understood, does this somehow imply that maybe even like the professional training of healthcare workers or even basic scientists needs to somehow delve more deeply, however uncomfortably, into like this sort of messy universe of the rest of the world out there in terms of like the public mind and patient perspectives? Because I think that it probably goes back to the idea in the philosophy of science that all science is inherently theory laden, and it's sort of, a lot of the biases that we are up against or find ourselves confronting stem from that and the lack of connectedness, perhaps, with how others outside our fields or areas of specialization um, uh, see things or the same things, supposedly. So I don't know. Do you think that we need to somehow also, this I guess goes beyond like ontologies per se, but it requires some kind of reworking of the basic training that students go through from like even perhaps the undergraduate level and basic medical training and things like that, and what kinds of activities or um, or content might help affect something like that.
So I think the primary observation is that when we're trying to create a conceptualization of a domain, there's not very much that is not affected by our perspective, and this differs a lot depending on the direction you're approaching it from. I think that one of the main findings of
Karin, could you? I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you just hold on 10 seconds? We need to increase the audio. Sorry about this. Just can you? Okay. We had this issue. We had this issue. We tried. We thought we solved it, but apparently we did not yet. Maybe if you just play with the buttons and turn them to the right. So maybe if you could, so I think maybe now it should work, or it will work within 10 seconds, please. So I think we need you speaking.
Try again. Is it any better now?
Not so much. Can you say again something, please?
So, I guess I don't want to start answering. Maybe I'm going to have to stop again in 2 seconds. Is it at least a little bit better now? Maybe, hopefully.
No, but you need to keep on speaking in order to find the right button to turn.
I see. Well, my part, it's on the highest volume, I guess.
Yes, now we can hear you. Please.
Okay. Should I continue with the answer in this case then?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I mean, I think one of the main findings is that yeah, like our conceptualization of domains is like heavily affected by our kind of perspective. I mean, there's some interesting papers by I think Sabine Leonelli who writes about even kind of the ontologies themselves as being, you know, deeply kind of underpinned by our kind of interests in the scientific domain, and the way that this links to kind of the way that we have to write grants to get our funding and all of this kind of thing as well. I think my communications with clinicians in this context is that they were quite interested in whether this could be turned into you know, sort of education resources for awareness for things that they should be talking to patients about or asking patients about in the context of the clinics. You know, just because they don't think they see certain phenotypes in a clinic doesn't mean that patients aren't experiencing those. There may be reasons that they're not bringing them up or discussing them, or the fact that they're not being asked about them means that they don't necessarily think it's relevant, even though it's something that is of priority to them to some extent. I mean, I think this is part of a kind of greater push towards a kind of holistic medicine or kind of patient-centered medicine to some extent, and I hope that some of this kind of work can provide an evidential basis for movement in that kind of area. I mean, I don't find it especially depressing that you know, we do these investigations and find that, you know, everything is a lot more kind of complicated than we thought that maybe it was before. You know, and it's like this with kind of genetics as well. It's like, you know, we thought, okay, maybe there's going to be a kind of gene that's going to be for this thing and we'll be able to solve it, but it turns out that probably everything affects everything. But at least this gives us interesting problems to solve. And I think that's good, and it kind of sets the tone for what we will be doing in our next years. And that's fine. I hope that at least partially answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? So I have a question. So you have mentioned the you have could you mute yourself, please? So maybe now? Yes, okay. Yes, sorry. So thank you. So in your talk, you have frequently mentioned the need, or in the beginning, you talked a lot about how axioms in the conceptualization are important. And in the end, especially for the text mining, there's very little use of the axioms. It's just the taxonomy that you exploit in different forms for similarity computation, for the enrichment analysis. So my question is, what do you think is the role of axioms in ontologies, where this community here has invested a lot of effort in creating good and rich axiomatizations? So what do you think is the role of the axioms to improve the methods that you have developed?
I think this is a very interesting question. I mean, I think that in the field as a whole, the role of axioms is actually very limited. Even in our kind of more modern approaches of integrating kind of ontologies with machine learning, it is not so much that the axiom means anything, so much as by virtue of the reasoner, it places something nearby something else in a graph. And this is something we can make use of, which is kind of a gross use of the work that has been put into kind of developing the axioms. And I think the answer is I don't know. I mean, I think axioms provide us this ability to kind of describe things in the context of other kinds of entities, and I think that is kind of useful in the sense that it allows us to kind of find relevant entities. It's these diseases or phenotypes, but where this is useful is not so much in kind of automatically traversing the axiom, so much as it is that we have that kind of information there, and we can extract manually what we want. I mean, I think it is a bit of a question for the soul searching of the ontology community, maybe to some extent, the role of how useful axioms actually kind of are. I had some initial evidence from a paper a couple of years ago that you could actually go in the opposite direction to try to develop kind of axioms from text-mined information, which could in some cases kind of improve characterization, but it was unclear that this was actually kind of any better than just making up additional annotations. It's kind of like we were adhering to this kind of tradition of adding axioms, but the thing that we're gaining benefit from is not so much the description logic or the description logic axioms themselves. There's also the question of it kind of helping us to, in a valid way, in a complete and consistent way, develop these domain conceptualizations that are internally consistent. But it's unclear that them being fully internally consistent is actually helpful if we're not really using the reasoner for anything. And also that we still have like kind of vast swathes of kind of inconsistency because of differences in kind of conceptualization choices across different ontologies, and it's unclear that perhaps these problems can even be solved at this stage after all of this work has gone in, as you've said. But yes, that's my thoughts on those issues.